Good afternoon, and welcome to the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Museum. We're here this afternoon in order to celebrate two major events. One occurring tomorrow, called President's Day, even though officially it still remains Washington's birthday in the federal calendar. But because of it, we're going to use that occasion today in order to honor our favorite son, 31st President Herbert Hoover. And with us we have probably the leading practitioner of portraying Mr. Hoover, and that is Carl Christensen. We are also here today in order to acknowledge the culmination of really a tremendous scholarly effort. And for those of you who have been faithful in both purchasing and reading the Herbert Hoover biography series that has been sponsored by the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Association, you realize both why this is a moment of both anticipation and excitement. Because this really is the culmination of what was intended to be a definitive biography and reference work on the 31st President. So many people were involved with that, and the sad note is that the author, Gary Dean Best, has passed. He submitted the manuscript almost a decade ago, and the Library Association made a decision to continue to publish the volumes chronologically, in chronological order. And so while he cannot be with us today, probably we have the next best thing with Director Tim Walsh. Tim really oversaw much of the evolution and editing of the final three volumes. And he has kind of the inside story about this whole series, its importance, and also how it came to the ultimate fruition today. And so our program's in two parts. Once again, this is all thanks to the support we get from the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Association. There are many of the board members in the audience today, and we'd like to take this moment to thank you. So without further ado, let me introduce you to the 31st President of the United States, President Herbert Hoover.
Tom, thank you for that very generous introduction. I thought of myself as a student, a parent, an engineer, a politician, hopefully a humanitarian, but I'll have to add practitioner to my lexicon. With that having been said, if I can find my glasses, I'll be able to see what we're trying to tell you. Good afternoon. May I add my thank you for your coming here this afternoon. It's always a pleasure to see the people in West Branch. I enjoy that very much. It's a very special occasion for me to be in West Branch, and I'm very sorry that Mrs. Hoover couldn't join me. She sends her warmest greetings and her regrets for not being here. She's involved heavily with the Girl Scouts, and when you're involved with the Girl Scouts, that takes first precedence. To help set the tone for the next few minutes, let me remind you that today's date is February 17th, 1931. 31, not 13. I thought perhaps we might review some of the events in my life that have become parts of the marvelous biographical series of which today's volume is the finale. Before we go any further, some of you may have concluded that I am reading the words that you hear. You're entirely correct. It is part of my style that I have adopted with regard to public speaking. I learned early on that one is subject to a vast amount of misinterpretation and misquoting. And in avoidance of that, I prefer to have an accurate evidence of what I said. The result has earned a comment from my good friend Ding Darling, the Pulitzer Prize winning cartoonist in Des Moines, who has characterized me as speaking more to my best buttons than to my audiences. But with deference to that, he also characterizes me in a number of other ways, and I would show you just a small version of some of those characterizations. You'll find a larger version on the table by the calligrapher, and you're certainly welcome to take one when you leave. They may entertain you as much as they do me. Okay, my siblings. Tad and May and I were orphaned in 1884 when our mother passed away. Our father had preceded her by about 4 years. It was decided by various generous relatives that parenting of the three of us would best be served by remaining with family, even though that would require separation, at least for the time being. With that in mind, my destination was the home of Dr. John Henry Minthorn in Oregon. I boarded a train here in West Branch, and with a box of food, a small box of personal things and clothing, and 20 cents in cash, headed out for the West. Over the next few years, as a member of the Minthorn family, I attended school, I was assigned family chores, and found time for boyhood pleasures in baseball, fishing, and swimming in a nearby stream with other village boys. When I was 15, Dr. Minthorn started a business in Salem, and I became the office boy, for which I was paid between $15 and $20 each month for my work. From this job, however, I gained 3 very important things. With the help of the stenographer, I became fairly proficient with the typewriter, which in later years I traded for a short lead pencil, which can sharpen and much easier to run than a typewriter. From working with the dark Scotsman bookkeeper, I developed the conviction that bookkeeping was indeed a cheerless calling. And from talking with a visiting engineer, I became involved with the idea of someday becoming an engineer myself. A business college opened in Salem, and I was able to enroll for night sessions. The teacher knew much of mathematics and Latin. Finding my predilection for mathematics, he took me through algebra, geometry, and higher arithmetic. I can add that he was less successful with my Latin. At 17, I learned of a new university starting in California. I applied to Stanford and was approved to take the entrance exam that would be conducted in Portland by a Dr. Swain, coincidentally a Quaker. He quickly noted my deficiencies in nearly all but mathematics and encouraged me to come to Palo Alto about 3 months early for tutoring, which he would arrange. I followed his advice, and after the additional instruction, I retook the entrance exam and barely, but honestly, repaired the earlier damage. Insofar as my student performance at Stanford, I flunked only one course, German. And while respectable in other courses, never achieved an A in any of them. Now, I worked at a variety of minor jobs to continue to pay my way, and I received some help from my brother Tad, who occasionally sent small amounts of money when he could. Later, I was able to help him, and he too graduated from Stanford as an engineer. Eventually, we often worked together in various parts of the world, operating mines and other enterprises. I should also mention that while in school, I was elected to the position of treasurer of my class. The next time that I ran for office was for the presidency of the United States, an election that I won as well. I am now in the second year of that employment, and I've learned a couple of new words. While at Stanford, one of my jobs was all-around handy boy in the geology lab. It was there that I met Miss Lou Henry, certainly a major event in my life. She had entered the geology laboratories determined to pursue and teach that subject as a livelihood. I felt that it was my duty to aid the young lady in her studies, both in the laboratory and in the field as well. My call to duty was stimulated by her whimsical mind, her blue eyes, and a broad smile that came from an early Irish ancestor, I'm sure. When I left college, she needed 3 years to complete her work. I saw her once or twice during this time, and we carried on our friendship from that point forward by correspondence. At my graduation, as I listened to Dr. Jordan's fine commencement address, my mind was mostly on the sinking realization that a new era was opening for me, and that I was facing it with only $40 in cash and the immediate need to find a job. The Depression of 1893 had reached the Pacific coast in 1895. I had lived on modest resources all of my life, but never heard of depressions. No one had told me that one was afoot. It certainly did not occur to me that depression was a word that would become part of my life in another time. My first job was as a laborer in a mine in the California mountains, followed by a stint as an engineer with a mining company in San Francisco, where I did mostly office design work. In 1897, I was hired by Berwick Moring, a British firm with mining interests in Australia that I was hired to supervise. In 1899, I was offered a huge signing bonus, $25,000, to take an assignment in China. Now, Lou was graduating, and naturally, before I accepted, I wired her a proposal of marriage. She responded by wire, of course, affirmatively. I returned to California, arriving on February 9th. We were joined in wedlock on February 10th and set sail for China on February 11th. We spent about a year in China and then moved on to London, where a year later I was made a full partner in Berwick Moring, a real generous promotion. In 1911, I left Berwick and Moring to consult independently. Mrs. Hoover and I continued to travel the world for the next 4 years. In 1914, I was asked by the American consul in London to organize an evacuation for about 100,000 Americans who stood to end up in harm's way due to the impending war in Europe. I accepted that assignment and thus took my first big step on the slippery slope of public service and volunteerism. Excuse me. I called upon several friends and associates, and we set about organizing the evacuation. That required traveling throughout the lowlands, Belgium and Holland. The armies had conscripted all of the available foodstuffs, and I saw firsthand the effects on the civilian population, especially the children. That was a turning point in my life. Following the evacuation came the organization of the Commission for Relief in Belgium, which ultimately was able to provide thousands of tons of food for distribution to hungry civilians in Europe. Mrs. Hoover and I returned to the United States, who was entering the war at that point, and I was asked by President Wilson to organize the Food Administration. This was aimed at encouraging citizens to conserve available food supplies, to ensure that there would be the amounts needed for the armed forces, and to do it without civilian rationing. Meatless days and eat potato days were described as Hooverizing, and supporting the slogan of "Food will win the war." My next challenge came in 1920 when President Harding appointed me Secretary of Commerce. Here I had the opportunity to exercise my particular passion for standardization. As an example, when I started in that job, milk was delivered to consumers in 49 different sized bottles. By now, it has been reduced to 9 sizes, with no loss in consumer availability and satisfaction. All we had to do was let the dairy people know what they needed to do. We have just concluded a decade of immense progress in so many aspects of our lives. The automobile has gone from a rarity to being almost universally owned, thanks certainly in part to Mr. Ford and his people. Just 6 years ago, in 1925, a local young man named Arthur Collins in Cedar Rapids, using his own hand-built equipment, achieved radio contact with the Macmillan expedition in Greenland. Our Navy communications people had had great difficulty trying to do that. The resulting national notoriety has positioned young Mr. Collins to begin a commercial business in radio manufacture right here in Idaho, Iowa. Slip of the tongue. In 1926, we established regular mail delivery service between cities by airplanes, as well as transportation of passengers. At the beginning of the 20s, diarrhea was one of the leading causes of infant death in this country. The development of better milk, better product handling, and pasteurization techniques for milk has greatly reduced this appalling statistic. The U.S. now has one of the lowest infant death rates in the world. A wonderful project that I participated starting some 10 years ago was formation of the Colorado River Commission. This great river flows through 7 states, dropping several hundred feet and storing vast amounts of energy before flooding its lower reaches in the Imperial Valley of California. President Harding appointed me to chair a group made up of representatives from the 7 states through which it flows. Our objective was to capitalize on this valuable resource, providing flood control, water for irrigation in the states through which it flows, and an additional benefit was perceived in utilizing the natural drop in the huge volume of water to generate electricity. On June 25th, last year, I signed the Boulder Canyon Project Act that appropriates $165 million excuse me, to build a mighty dam on the Arizona-Nevada border. As part of harnessing this powerful river to the benefit of millions of our citizens. Additionally, construction will provide needed employment to nearly 5,000 workers for 5 years. And it might not hurt economically a small town nearby in Nevada, Las Vegas, I think it's called. And by the way, the proceeds from the sale of electrical power by a publicly owned company, not the government, will be returned to the government and will ultimately pay for the entire project. We're very proud of that. In closing, allow me to remind you of the fine volume that's being offered today. To say that I'm flattered for being featured in this many books is understatement of the highest order. This, the final volume in the series, describes my life from my presidency to the end. I can hardly wait to see how it turns out. Thank you for your kind time and kind attention. I hope you enjoy the day.
Well, hello everybody. It's been a while since I've been here. Of course, over 23 years, I talked to a lot of different groups, particularly school kids. And I remember, one clever fifth grader asked me before I talked to the group, well, what's it like listening to you? And I said, well, it's a lot like listening to your grandpa. Thinking that he was going to accept the notion of great wisdom. And he said, oh, you mean you talk too much, you talk too loud, and you don't make a lot of sense. So, with apologies to grandpas everywhere, I want to deliver a few remarks on the anniversary of the completion, I should say the commemoration of the completion of this 6th volume of the life of Herbert Hoover. And it is an extraordinary achievement. Tom and I were talking before we came into the auditorium about how few presidents have had multi-volume biographies. I mean, there are a number, of course, Madison, Jefferson, Washington, Lincoln, and I suppose Robert Caro's multi-volume biography on Johnson. But not every president has received that kind of attention, and so we are pleased to have this completed. And we're here to recognize, of course, the incredible scholars, the authors of these volumes. George Nash, who we all know and love as a good friend of West Branch. Kendrick Clements, who wrote George, of course, wrote the first 3 volumes. And then Kendrick Clements, who wrote volume 4 on Hoover's years as Secretary of Commerce. Glenn Jinsone on Hoover's presidential years, and then the late Gary Dean Best on Hoover's years as a former president. But we're also here to recognize the benefactors, because a project like this would not have been possible if it were not for generous people to step forward and to provide us with the kind of funding that was necessary. And that credit goes to the J.M. Foundation in New York, the Herbert Hoover Foundation, and of course multiple members of the Hoover Presidential Library Association. And then, of course, through book sales, people like you, readers like you, as we sometimes hear on PBS. Well, the purpose of this talk is also really to talk a little bit about the magnitude of presidential biography, and there's a backstory to it. Because quite frankly, it would not have been possible to do this biography of Herbert Hoover, or many of the other presidential biographies, were it not for the presidential library system as a whole. And I think, as most of you know, the system really begins as something of an accident in the late 1930s when Franklin Roosevelt goes to the Library of Congress, where he had planned to deposit his papers, and found that he couldn't get his wheelchair through the aisles of what's now called the Adams Building, and made a decision shortly thereafter to build a separate library at his family estate in Hyde Park, New York. That is the first presidential library. He makes a decision to build it with private money. It certainly would have been controversial to build it with government money, but he'll donate it to the federal government with the papers and records of his administration. And he selected the National Archives, an agency that he had established in 1934, to be the federal agency to run this presidential library. And that's the first one, of course, until Harry Truman leaves office. And Truman, of course, opens a presidential library in 1957. And shortly before that, comes the Presidential Library Act of 1955, which provides for all presidents to have presidential libraries should they decide to build it with their own money, and then, or with money raised for them, and then donate it to the federal government along with papers. And so all of our presidents have presidential libraries, which has encouraged the study of the presidency, and more specifically, the writing of presidential biographies. And we've seen the system evolve from President Hoover chronologically here in West Branch to President George W. Bush, President Bush 43, whose library is soon to open on the campus of Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. Now, these libraries are very different from one another. I know all of you have visited a number of them, and although we are all part of the same family, it's a little bit like kids. We're all individuals. We might have the same DNA, but it seems to manifest itself in a different way. We all have education programs. We all have research programs, public programs, and exhibits. And I want to say just a few words about, of course, the scholarly side of it, the research side, which is exactly what has led to these presidential biographers. And of course, when this institution opened in 1962, it's been more than 50 years, the papers and records of the Hoover presidency had not been widely available. When Mr. Hoover left office, he took those papers and he deposited them in the Hoover Institution on the campus of Stanford University, but they were not widely available to scholars without Mr. Hoover's permission. But in 1962, when the building opened, Mr. Hoover signed a deed of gift which would make those papers available. And they became available, as I understand it, for the first time in 1966. And that is what attracted scholars to this institution, including scholars from the University of Iowa. We're fortunate to have with us today, for example, Professor Ellis Hawley of the University of Iowa. And along with his colleague, the late Professor Lawrence Gelfand, they produced a body of their own research based on work that they did here in our collections, but also encouraged and directed students of doctoral dissertations that used the holdings here. And so there became a culture of scholarly research that took place here at the library, which then laid the groundwork for future presidential biography. Professor Don Liscio, who some of you may remember from Coe College, also produced a number of books, as did Rosemary Carroll, his colleague from Coe. These books helped to generate new and additional books. Hundreds of scholars have, in fact, thousands actually, have used the holdings, assisted by that first generation of archivists who I want to mention, Dwight Miller, Dale Meyer, Pat Woldenberg, Mildred Mather, who among others, and there were others who came before who I did not know, who helped direct scholarship on all aspects of Mr. Hoover's career. And in addition to the Hoover papers, they solicited a whole variety of other collections. There are over 300 collections of individuals' papers here, from a single folder ranging up to hundreds of linear feet, all of which help tell the story of this extraordinary life, which has led to the 6 volumes that we commemorate today. All, not all, but many contributing to the Hoover story. This work, of course, is carried on today by people like Lynn Smith, Matt Schaefer. I know both of them are here, Craig Wright, Spencer Howard. So we've had a second generation of archivists who continue to assist scholars in doing the kind of research here. Now, as to the Hoover biography, 2 scholars came here shortly after the papers were opened and produced 2 books that seem to have a lasting impact. One, a sort of a popular biography, one, a more scholarly biography. And those that I refer to are the brief biography by Joan Hoff Wilson called Herbert Hoover, Forgotten Progressive, which was published in 1975. And believe it or not, I think it's still the most widely available and most popular biography that we sell in our bookstore here, even though it is old, probably in need of a new edition. But that book came out in 1975. And then the second I want to mention was David Verner's book, Herbert Hoover, A Public Life, which was based on more extensive scholarly research in our holdings. That book, alas, is out of print. And of course, there have been other biographies of Herbert Hoover published in the 80s. But those 2 books kind of set the mark for Hoover biography. And even though those books did appear in the 70s, The trustees of the Hoover Library Association felt that that wasn't sufficient, that they themselves wanted to take action to encourage more biography, to produce a definitive scholarly biography. There was a dismay on their part about the negative image of Herbert Hoover and his career that was often reflected in high school and college textbooks, which of course focused just on the presidency. And they felt one way to remedy this circumstance would be to commission a scholar without their control or influence to produce a, at that point they weren't sure how long the book would be or the work would be, but a scholarly biography of Herbert Hoover. And with the financial support, as I mentioned, of the J.M. Foundation, which was directed by Jeremiah Milbank Jr., I believe, there were several Jerry Milbanks, and Alan Hoover, the president's son, they went forward. Now, at that time, there was no clear definition for the term definitive scholarly biography. And that's a term that can be defined in many different ways and with as much rigor as you wish. Any of you who have read this work will know that there's varying levels of how you define those terms. But before the project could begin to produce this definitive scholarly biography, they had to raise the money. And that took some time, but it was in fact accomplished. And then the question was, where do you find a scholar to produce a multi-volume biography? There have been other biographies, they have been pursued by individual scholars, but it wasn't evident to anyone at that time who would be the one to produce this multi-volume book on Herbert Hoover. Well, Alan Hoover and Jerry Milbank went to William F. Buckley Jr. In New York in 1975, I believe. This is some of this is information that I've acquired over the years, so I'm recalling from memory. And Buckley nominated a young postdoctoral scholar named George Nash from Harvard University, who had interviewed Buckley for his doctoral dissertation. George, as you may recall, did a dissertation called The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America since 1945, and Bill Buckley is a big part of it. He was very impressed with this George Nash. He knew that in 1975 it was hard to get an academic appointment teaching, and that George did not have an academic appointment. Perhaps he'd be willing to engage in this multi-volume biography. And in fact, Hoover and Milbank approached George, and in fact he agreed to do that. They also helped to go forward to locate a publisher. And because Buckley, of course, is well known in publishing circles in New York, he approached Donald Lamb, who was the publisher and principal editor at W.W. Norton Company, and asked if they would be interested in doing this biography of Herbert Hoover, and Lamb agreed. And so they had the funding, they had the scholar, and they had the publisher to go forward. At that point, George assessed the situation and informed the trustees that this was quite a life, and knowing the volume of documentation, that it would be a multi-volume biography. Perhaps a few of the trustees at that time gulped, but they were not dismayed, and they went forward with the definitive scholarly biography. And as you know, the first volume was published in 1983 to widespread acclaim. As planned, this volume covered Mr. Hoover's life up to 1914 and was subtitled The Engineer. It certainly was scholarly and definitive. George had even traveled to England and Australia for documentary research, so there's no question that it covers Mr. Hoover's life up to 1914 in full. Now, he continued his journey and initially planned, I'm told, that the second volume would cover Mr. Hoover's humanitarian work in Belgium and perhaps beyond that throughout World War I, essentially the years from 1914 to 1923. But as George continued his research, he found that he had more material on those years than could be accommodated in a single volume, and so that second volume was cut off in 1917, covering just Mr. Hoover's work on the Commission for Relief in Belgium. The second volume was subtitled The Humanitarian. It appeared in 1988, and again, the reviews were exceptional and laudatory. He continued his research on Mr. Hoover's life and found the volume of material of great consequence, and produced a third volume, longer even than the second, but covering only Mr. Hoover's years as U.S. Food Administrator, 1917 to 1918, a period of about 18 months. Well, this did cause a certain amount of concern among the trustees because, as you can see, we're covering less and less time in each of these subsequent volumes. The third volume was called Master of Emergencies, was completed in 1995, published in 1996, and it was sent to Donald Lamb at Norton. When Lamb saw the size of the manuscript for Volume 3 and realized that it was covering only 18 months, so I am told, he became concerned and sent a letter to the trustees. He praised the quality of George's work. There was no question about its rigor, but noted that such a narrow focus would limit its potential sales as a book. And he urged the association to refocus the series on the three major themes that remained: Mr. Hoover's commerce years, the presidency, and then the post-presidency. Now, the trustees began negotiations with George on how to ensure the balance of these volumes in the biography would follow that path. I wasn't present at these negotiations, but the end result was evident that George and the association could not reach terms and conditions that were acceptable to both parties. The point of disagreement was primarily over the original intent of producing a definitive scholarly biography and what that meant by that term, how much academic rigor and focus would be in each of the volumes. From what I know, the end of George's time as the biography of Herbert Hoover was amicable. As I say, a difference in focus. George remains a good friend of the library and a supporter of the project. In fact, he actually has the last word in the series. If you pick up a copy of Gary Dean Best's 6th volume, there is an afterword by George Nash, which I think is very appropriate to have George have the first word and the last word in the series. Well, the project moves forward after George's departure, and that's when I became involved. Up to 1996, as I mentioned, I had no direct involvement, so what I've told you thus far essentially is what I was told, but I like to think that it's reasonably accurate. And with George's departure, the trustees, and more particularly the biography committee, was in a quandary about what direction they should take in going forward. George had produced 3 spectacular volumes, but it only took Mr. Hoover up to the age of 45. He's got 45 more years of a very busy life. In fact, the busiest 45 years to follow. And there was no obvious scholar to step in to replace George. Add to the circumstance the fact that there's a limited amount of resources, a euphemism for money, to ensure the completion of the project. So, although theoretically we had a publisher, we no longer had a biographer, and we were concerned about the availability of additional resources. The biography committee considered several options, one of which was to abandon the notion of a definitive scholarly biography and the multi-volume approach and commission an author to write a single popular biography of Herbert Hoover, in effect to accomplish the task, the larger task, without the scholarship. That option was intended to meet a need for a well-written but easy-to-read book that would appeal to a broad section of the country. That was a bold step. The biography committee could not reach a consensus that it wanted to abandon the multi-volume approach. The sense of the committee, as I recall the deliberation, was to move forward with a second option, 3 additional scholarly volumes as suggested by Donald Lamb. The committee struggled, therefore, with how to produce 3 volumes in a reasonable number of years. Could this be done by a single author, and if so, who? So we still face the dilemma of who replaces George. I was asked to seek out potential candidates, but the task seemed overwhelming for a single author. No viable names resulted, and the committee then asked if 3 authors, I thought this was a rather bold move, if 3 authors could work on the 3 remaining volumes simultaneously. I couldn't give an answer, but agreed to talk to historians and scholars and report their input. And I spoke to Larry Gelfand and to Ellis, as well as to Professor Robert Farrell, and other senior historians. And all who I talked to said it was possible, but who were the 3 scholars? And so I began the quest for 3 senior scholars with knowledge, skills, and abilities to produce those 3 remaining volumes. Now, the last volume in the series, the one we're talking about and commemorating today, was the easiest to assign. Gary Dean Best of the University of Hawaii was the leading scholar of the post-presidential career of Herbert Hoover, and there was no question in my mind that we should start by talking to Gary, who was a friend, to determine if he would take on the task of revisiting his previous scholarship and expanding on that work for the last volume in the series. And we were fortunate, at least I was fortunate certainly, that the project came at a time when Gary was willing to take on that task. So far, so good. Unfortunately, there were no logical candidates for the other two volumes. I discussed the name of potential biographers with Larry and Ellis and Bob, and quickly settled on Kendrick Clements, a very capable scholar from the University of South Carolina. Clements had written well-regarded books on the World War I era and on Woodrow Wilson and on the 1920s. Had been a researcher here and done a perceptive review of George's third volume in the American Historical Review. The association made an offer, and we were blessed that Ken was willing to take on the task of writing about Herbert Hoover in that critical decade from the end of World War I, the end of George's third volume, up to Hoover's inauguration as president on March 4th of 1929. And I'm sure you'll agree, if you've read the book, that the result was spectacular and fulfills the intent of a definitive scholarly biography. So, 2 down, 1 to go. The volume on the presidency was problematic, arguably the most difficult 4 years of Herbert Hoover's life. They were also 4 years of his life that had previously received the greatest amount of attention from other scholars. We wanted a fresh and sympathetic assessment of Hoover's presidency, but who would take on this volume? Again, I went to the senior scholars, and they suggested a young historian who had worked at the Hoover Library, was looking for the next big project to take his career up to the next level. I talked to this young scholar, and he agreed, and off we went. By the end of 1997, we had 3 scholars working on 3 volumes simultaneously, and it was our hope and plan that all 3 manuscripts would be ready for publication in 2008. You know, they say, life is what happens to you when you were planning to do other things. Well, having enlisted the 3 scholars, I stepped aside, as did the committee, to allow the scholars the time to do their work. Clements and Best became regular visitors over the next several years and diligently worked their way through our collections. But the young fellow who had taken on the presidency hit a bump in the road. He'd become the department chairman, and also that absorbed much of his time, and then he faced several family issues. And as time went on, he had to face the prospect of not completing the project on a timely basis. Reluctantly, he agreed to bow out. So we were back to square one on the presidency. The answer to this dilemma was right there in our reading room. Professor Glenn Jinsone of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee was a prolific biographer and historian who had begun a 1-volume biography of Herbert Hoover. We were blessed when Glenn agreed to set aside that project to take on the Hoover presidency. Although he started several years after Ken and Gary, Glenn caught up quickly, and many of you were here, I think it was last year, when we celebrated the publication of that volume. One matter remained. I mentioned that the 3 elements, you had to have a biography, you had to have the funding, and you had to have the publisher. Well, in the intervening time between the publication of George's 3rd volume, Donald Lamb retired. I did approach the current editorial staff at W.W. Norton, but without Donald Lamb's support and passion for the project, there was little interest on their part in going forward with the 3 remaining volumes. So having been rebuffed by Norton, the committee asked me to solicit the interest of other publishers. I contacted several book agents and was fortunate to receive the names and contact information of a half a dozen editors at major publishing firms. After several months of discussion and negotiation, the committee voted to sign a contract with Palgrave Macmillan. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Macmillan name, and Palgrave is part of that company that includes St. Martin's Press. Now most of these publishers have multiple labels and names, trade names. It's a major multinational publishing firm. So today we celebrate the publication of the last of the 3 volumes published by Palgrave and the overall success of the series. And as I mentioned, although many presidents have had multi-volume biographies, only a few, perhaps one or two, have had as many as 6 volumes covering their lives. This biography project is fitting testimony of a life well lived. Now, before we depart, let's stand for a moment of silence in memory of those who contributed to this project but are no longer with us. So I'd ask if you'd all please stand. In particular, as you peruse the final volume in this series, take a moment and read Glenn Jinson's foreword in that volume. It explains to all of us what a treasure we had in Gary Dean Best. And let's not forget the other individuals who did so much to ensure the success of this project. In memoriam, William F. Buckley Jr., Mark O. Hatfield, Alan Hoover, Herbert Hoover III, and Jeremiah Milbank Jr., among others. The completion of this project reminds us of their importance as guardians of the historical record. Thank you. And needless to say, go and buy that book.